pressing down and all those kinds of things. So I'm just showing you one way. It's the way that I typically use, it's the way I learned, and it's the way I want you to start out. However, beyond this, you're welcome to do more research to see how other people do it, especially if you find that the way I'm teaching you actually creates some difficulties for you. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start out by throwing a small piece of clay, so just about the size of a cup. So I got about the size of a softball, if I kind of punch it down, maybe between a baseball and a softball, and now I'm going to wedge it. I'm just going to do the boar's head, or ram's head, I'm sorry. I'm just going to do the ram's head wedge, and I think a safe thing to do would be to wedge it 30 times. So I'm just wedging it like this over and over again. I'm going to fast forward because I already had wedged it a little bit, and once I get done wedging it with the ram's head, I'm going to turn it over like this, slowly, so it's a long cylindrical shape, and I'm going to pick it up to the left. All right, just kind of tap it down. The reason we go to the left is because that's the direction of our wheel spinning, and it just makes the throwing a lot easier and makes it go a lot smoother. This is my wheel at home. I had just previously thrown with red clay on it. I'm going to, normally I'd clean it up in between the different types of clay, but for this demonstration, I'm just going to put it straight on this wheel. I want to make sure that I have a bucket of water next to my wheel and that my wheel is clean. So I'm just going to clean it off. I also want to make sure that it is dry. So I'm just going to use my apron for this and make sure I get it somewhat dry so that the clay will stick down. Next, I'm going to throw my clay down so it sticks. I'm checking to make sure that it's suctioned on there really well. Now I'm going to start spinning my wheel. I'm going to get my hands wet, and I'm going to start by doing some wheel wedging. So what that means is that I'm going to wrap my hands around the clay and squeeze up, keeping my hands wet the whole time, and then I'm going to form my hands like this, stacked on top of each other. I'm going to push down on the top of the clay with the back of this hand, while also kind of nesting my hand, my other hand, my left hand, around the clay. So I'm going to push down just gently, and then I'm going back up. It's really just to compress all the particles of my clay and to get them so they're kind of going in this cylindrical fashion. Once I've done that a few times, depending on how much you need to do it, I wedged my clay quite a bit beforehand, so I don't need to do it a ton. The next thing I'm going to do is center my clay. So to center my clay, really quick, it's really important that you keep your hands clean and wet. So you'll see I'm scraping my hands off and then re-wetting them. To center my clay, this part of my left hand is just resting against the clay. This part of my right hand is, actually it's more like this part, is pressing down kind of on the top corner, like this. So I'm pressing down, and I want to make sure that I'm pushing in and pressing down at the same time. If my clay is centered, then this hand will never move. If it's not centered, it'll kind of go back and forth like this. All right, so I'm going to make sure it's centered. I'm pushing in. Notice how my elbows are always on my knees to give me extra pressure and power. I'm always steadying my arms on something. I'm using a lot of my upper body strength and my core strength to make sure that it's not wobbling. I'm going to clean around this edge. And I'm kind of creating like a little plateau, sort of like this. Okay, once you have it centered, now it's time to go down from the center. So I'm going to use my middle finger, just because that's the way I was taught and it's just what works better for me. I'm going to use my other two fingers to kind of steady my middle finger. Again, my arm is using my leg as a brace as well as the edge of the wheel. And I'm just gonna go in the center and go straight down until I'm about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of my cup. So I'm just gonna start here and go straight down. Now, if you wanna test it, you can using a needle tool. I'm gonna turn this off. I can use my needle tool to kind of test it by going down in it and seeing where it ends up. So I'm a little more than 1/4 of an inch, which actually is fine for me because I do a lot of compressing of my bottom after I pull out, okay? So I'm gonna start this again. And now I'm gonna go straight down and I'm gonna pull my middle finger. I'm just gonna keep it steady and pull it towards me. So I'm gonna get it wet again. I'm gonna keep it down here and I'm just gonna pull it towards me. Now this is the part where a lot of things get really different. Not everybody pulls with just one finger. Notice how my hands are always touching each other and really keeping each other steady. All right, so I pulled out. I've created the bottom of my cup. It's about this big and flat all the way across. Now I'm gonna compress it. There are a couple different ways you can do this. You can use a sponge or your fingers. Compressing it is really important because it keeps the bottom from creating an S crack once it's fired and drying. All right, I'm also gonna compress my top, which I do kind of between each pull. I kind of create like a little bridge like this and push down with this finger while holding it steady with these two fingers, just to kind of compress it and give it strength. All right, next I'm gonna start pulling up. So I always pull up on the right-hand side of my cup. You start by on the outside, scooping under and getting as much clay as you can. This hand is really just the steady vector. So I'm gonna scoop down with these fingers, and notice how my hands are always touching, and then I'm going to keep my fingers the same distance apart and pull up and in. I'm pulling up and in because the tendency a lot of times is to pull up and out and you'll end up with a bowl, not a cup. All right, and our goal for our first project is just to do a straight up and down cup. So I pulled up, so now I'm gonna compress my top again. Pretty easy. And then I'm going to pull again. Now, I'm gonna show you a knuckle pull, which is something else that people do. So they'll create a knuckle with this hand. I'm still gonna use the fingers of my other hand, clean up my clay. I'm gonna lean way over, and I'm gonna use like this part of this hand against the clay as I pull up and in. All right, there you go. It's already getting pretty large, and this was just, remember, about this between the size of a baseball and a softball. One thing I'm really careful to do that is really easy to run into is I'm not getting my fingers closer to each other as I get towards the top. I want to keep the top as thick as the rest of it. So I want to make sure I'm not going up at the top and then bringing them together, okay? I'm keeping them apart. I'm gonna bring my bottom out just a tiny bit to straighten my walls. There we go. All right, so you could make it thinner than this. I'm actually gonna leave it this thickness. I think this is a good thickness that you should aim for. I'm gonna stop it just so you can see it a little bit better. It's a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. And now we wanna clean it up a little bit so we can take it off the wheel. So there are a couple things we need to do. First, we need to get the water out of the bottom of it. I'm gonna slow my wheel way down. There's no reason to go fast at this point. There's really no reason to go as fast as I was going for any of it until you get used to it. So I'm compressing my bottom again. I'm cleaning up any extra water. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna find my piece of chamois here. I'm just using a piece of fabric. In the past, I've used a piece of newspaper for this. We did have a chamois at school. If we can find, if that's available, you can use that, or you can choose a piece of newspaper. I'm just gonna get it wet and fold it like this. I'm gonna slow this down even more. And I'm just gonna go around the edge to make a nice soft lip to my cup. All right. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clean up this part right here to make it easier, because tomorrow I'll have to trim it. And so to kind of get ready for the trimming, I want to trim as much as I can at this point while it's still on the wheel. So I'm going to use, this is the best tool I think for that. I'm going to follow the curve of my cup and just kind of cut down in there until I get to the wheel. All right. And then I'm going to cut away. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my metal scraper. I like it because it's really flexible like this. I'm gonna use it to kind of scrape any extra moisture off the edges here. This is all that this metal scraper is for. Please don't ever use a metal scraper to clean off your wheel. It actually is really, really sharp. And so I've had somebody who it got stuck in the clay and then they end up cutting themselves. So be really careful not to do that. All right, so once you got it kind of cleaned up and about how you want it, this is definitely what I would consider kind of a thick mug. I wouldn't go any thicker than this. But what you'll notice is if I cut down in there, you would notice that the wall of it is the same all the way up. The biggest thing that people run into is that they leave too much clay down here on the bottom corner. And you really need to make sure that when you're going with the outside fingers that you're scooping it up and pulling that extra up. You can make your cup a lot taller that way or a lot wider, and you just don't want to waste that clay. You want to make sure that the outside of your cup matches the inside of your curve of your cup as well. Once you get it done, you're going to want to clean off your hands, make sure they're really dry. You'll cut it away with the wire cutter, and then you'll put it onto the drying shelf. Okay, so here is my cup. It's a pretty stout cup, pretty large. It's nice and thick to keep beverages warm. It could be a good soup cup. I can add a handle to it if I want to. I'm going to let it get leather hard, and then I'm going to actually trim it on the wheel, which will be another lesson later on. Once it's leather hard, that's when you add the handle. You can also carve into it if you want to. Anything like that. You can add your underglazes if you're doing any underglazing at that point as well. And don't forget, you have to sign it as well because it's some of your best art. All right, I'm excited to see what you come up with.